So welcome you all. This is our final session for the year in terms of the supported housing supervisors learning community. I certainly hope that you've enjoyed the subject matter so far, and hopefully this will bring a great culmination to the year's events. But welcome once again, and I certainly want to remind you that we are being recorded. We'll go through our usual housekeeping elements. Today's subject matter is really navigating the storms of life, supporting people in times of crisis. Let me first put a disclaimer out. There is no way we're going to be able to address all the crisis-related subject matters concerns today. I think I just want to focus on truly ensuring that we have a general understanding of crisis and how it relates particularly to mental health concerns, how it impacts people in supported housing, and what are the implications for supervision related to this particular subject. As we all know, we have gone through a sustained period of crisis in terms of the pandemic and other national and even regional concerns. So there's a lot to discuss here.
Also trying to work with landlords.
If we kind of want to remind people, if you can certainly mute, that will be helpful in terms of us moving forward and ensuring that we have less background disturbances. So welcome. Today's meeting is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive meeting as usual, and we encourage you to ask questions utilizing both the chat, and if you request, certainly you can unmute to engage. The slides and recording will be sent by email subsequent to the session. So our usual housekeeping, we certainly ask folks to utilize both the audio and video option. I put the call-in information in the chat if you have any kind of video challenges and you need to use the call-in option. We certainly ask people to share their concerns and questions and share feedback in the chat. And just be reminded that this particular session doesn't offer CEU, but it's certainly, you have opportunities to get both the recording and the PDF from the Washington State Healthcare Authority. We continue to strive to make our material as accessible as possible. So for those who are meeting for the first time, I am Earl Leach. I am today's facilitator. I'm the Senior Training Consultation Specialist here at Rutgers University School for Health Professions. And we're contracted by the Washington State Healthcare Authority to provide this particular learning community and other trainings across both foundational community supports and other service entities and other subject matters across Washington State DBHR. So what are we aiming to achieve today? What's our objectives? To really define crisis and delineate the distinction of a mental health crisis, to really look carefully and see how those are distinguished differently, to distinguish the essential principles of appropriate crisis response, really look at what underpins those appropriate response to crisis, what are really the principles that guide us in terms of appropriately responding to crisis, to recognize crisis interventions as a critical service in supported housing services, and really to describe the interventions for effective mental health crisis response. So we're really looking at crisis in its general sense, in some more distinct aspects of it, how to appropriately respond to crisis, and how it impacts supported housing services and its importance in that regard. So that's generally what we're aiming to achieve today. And as we know, crisis really presents to us oftentimes in that aspect of a storm. So when we talk about the storms of life, and how crisis really reflects in that manner. What's important, I know for me in particular, I hope for you, is that I really got what I would consider the most poignant way of looking at it from Pat Day, who said, "It is not a question of whether we will encounter a storm, but when and how we will navigate and survive the test of that storm." And that is so poignant for us in this particular field, in this particular time across our nation, and almost internationally, as we all continue to wade through the storm of the pandemic and related and proximal concerns. So crisis intervention, crisis management, crisis awareness is both poignant and ubiquitous in today's world. I don't think there is any way in which we can exist and thrive in this community and in this state without really truly understanding, appreciating the value of managing crisis well, to thrive despite crisis. So what is a crisis? Oftentimes, there's a number of definitions that are used oftentimes interchangeably or in many other ways to describe a crisis. What's true and what's real is that even the experts and researchers have not been able to really find a consistent definition that really speaks to crisis. So we oftentimes find the one that is more generally used. And in this case, we speak to crisis in terms of looking at crisis as an acute disruption of psychological homeostasis. And before someone says, "Earl, what are you talking about? You know, why are you using these terms?" instead of just giving us kind of the layman terms of it. In essence, it's really that disruption in your equilibrium, your balance, really your nucleus being shaken, all that element of what's normal, what's stable being really disrupted. And it really also is defined by the fact that your usual coping mechanism have failed or continue to fail despite your effort. And there exists evidence of distress and dysfunction in the sense of functional impairment. Your normal functioning is significantly disrupted. And the way in which you coped in the past with things that change that equilibrium is no longer working. Hence a crisis. It's really the subjective reaction to a stressful life experience that compromises that individual stability. So it's also not merely that functional impairment and that shakeup of your balance and your sense of normalcy, but it really speaks to those functional impairments that defines your way of coping, your way of living, and it really speaks to all that you've had in terms of coping mechanism not working, not really meeting your needs as they usually do.
My protective time, doing
and that speaks to the crisis definition that is more commonly used across most service entities, particularly in human services, social work, counseling, and allied services. What I want to do is certainly ask folks, have you found another definition of crisis, or do you use another definition of crisis that is different in some ways, or has a greater expansive definition? I just found this one to be really succinct and really hit all the elements that would give you the opportunity to see crisis behaviorally, understand crisis from a description, and truly be able to assess it consistently in the same manner. Hence the reason why we kind of identify this particular definition as probably the most common one that is used in the field. But certainly, if you have another definition, or if you found one that you think is certainly more clarifying, I'd certainly love to know that. And is this the way in which your organization defines crisis? I'll just give you a few seconds to kind of ponder that. Is there a different way in which is defined by yourself or by your organization, by your agency? I'd certainly like to know that. So certainly take a moment to share if you have, because what I then want to step into is oftentimes in our practice, in our field, there's often that difficulty distinguishing whether something is truly a crisis. And do we then put the label of crisis on every thing that is deemed to be problematic or challenging or not able to be resolved in a quick manner or in a manner that we find our normal coping mechanism working quickly? How do we really differentiate what stands out as a crisis? And the way I found really practical and helpful to do that, and we've used that in terms of really guiding supervisors in understanding that distinction, is really discerning what's a crisis, what's an emergency, and what's a problem. And Natalie says, I believe it depends on the individual. What is a crisis to one person may not be to another, and vice versa. Absolutely, Natalie. I think you're spot on with that one. How someone, and that's why we spoke to, when we spoke to a crisis in terms of the definition, it's important to note the subjective reaction to a stressful situation. That element there, because that is really what's going to guide us in terms of how we best intervene with that person, how we best support that person. It's really a subjective, individualized perspective, but there's some general features that can help us identify a crisis. Someone's functional challenges, someone's inability to use that, or that coping mechanism is no longer working, that element, and there's clear disruption in that person's general functioning. So there's functional impairments. But that's definitely a great point, that it's really subjective in terms of that person's perspective of it as a crisis. So we once again spoke to really having a great sense or a better sense of really distinguishing a crisis from a problem or an emergency. And how do we do that? There's a number of ways of doing that, but the one that we found to be really easy to discern, easy to utilize, is really looking at a problem is more that may be created by stress and be difficult to solve. So oftentimes it is a challenge to solve. But if the individual that you're working with or supporting or providing services is able to demonstrate the capacity to resolve it without outside intervention, it is not a crisis. It's a problem. So even though it's difficult and hard to solve, if the person has the capability, they're able to demonstrate that, either by articulating that or by history, able to address that situation without external intervention, it is often not a crisis. And a good example of that is oftentimes an interpersonal challenge, where that person may have that assertiveness, coping skills, but a situation, whether it's because of the person that is with, makes it challenging to utilize that coping mechanism, but the person has the capacity to demonstrate that by history, then that's more of a problem. And it's really about supporting them in terms of being to activate those coping mechanisms, as opposed to really creating or bringing into evidence coping mechanism that is outside of their scope. So I hope you're able to make that distinction, that it's more of a, even though a problem is a challenge, if the person has the capacity, the wherewithal to actually resolve it and don't need outside intervention, then it's more of a problem. An emergency, on the other hand, is unpredictable. And it's oftentimes an acute situation, sudden, significant, profound, and it poses a serious and immediate risk to health, life, or property, and demands an immediate response. Significant distinction. Now, what you will find as we go further is that an emergency may be part of a crisis, but they're not necessarily one and the same, and it's not always that case. There's oftentimes a crisis. There can be a crisis without an emergency. So it's important to note that emergency in terms of its unpredictability, the serious and emergent need to intervene immediately, and the imposition of risk to health, life, or property. Whereas a crisis, on the other hand, is more of that disruption and breakdown in the person's normal or usual pattern of functioning. And in essence, a crisis cannot be resolved by that person's customary way of problem solving. And I know this may seem simplistic, but it's important because the manner in which we discern and define the issue determines how we intervene, what's an appropriate intervention. And I hope that is clearly understood in that sense, if there's any questions there. Because what I want to emphasize here is that a crisis is not an emergency, and an emergency is not a crisis. The two are independent of each other, although they certainly can coexist. And what happens is too often, a crisis is responded to inappropriately as if it were an emergency, and vice versa. And often what that results in is resources being wasted or the client receiving unsuitable care. And that's why we hope that with a clearer definition, it will lead to more appropriate clinical decision-making about how to intervene specific to that distinguished issue. So you don't provide crisis care to an emergency situation and vice versa. Any questions there? Is that clear? Is that clear? Is that understood? Is that something that you find that you can utilize in terms of really determining what's the best approach for the circumstances faced based on how you define and articulate that particular circumstance? Even with consumers, if you really address it as a problem, oftentimes the approach to it may be very different. And Viliek, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name correctly, asked for examples. And thank you for that. An emergency in an example, for example, is if someone you arrive at the scene with a consumer that you're there to provide services to, and that person is speaking clearly in that moment about self-harming behavior or harm to others in that situation, and that person is demonstrating an inability to really clearly give you any indication as to what are all the other variables, but there's a clear and discernible indication that that person has articulated a plan and have the means to actually hurt themselves or others, and they're making those claims. That's an emergency situation that requires an emergent care. It's not prudent to be going over or trying to attempt to decipher whether or not it's within that person's capacity to articulate or utilize coping mechanisms. In that moment, if that person is making that clear and discernible threat, you have to have an emergency response, and therefore you're taking it as an emergency. Whereas in a crisis, a person may have an interpersonal crisis with a loved one or a parent, and is really talking about, I've tried using assertiveness skills, or I've tried talking to that person in a calm manner, and I'm not getting the response I'm wanting. It's really creating a tremendous amount of disturbance in my life. And if that person calls again, I may say something I dislike, or I may end up, particularly in a landlord tenant situation. The person is basically making clear the landlord is getting on my nerves. I've tried talking to him calmly. I've tried talking to him in this manner, and nothing is working. And he's basically saying to me, if I continue to speak to him like that, it may result in some kind of impact on my tenancy. Now, that person's normal coping mechanism, which is to really find their assertiveness skills or utilize de-escalation skills, may not be working in that moment, in the moment. But that person may be supported by your interventions or helping them find a calm place to kind of find their center and then determine what's the best approach. It may require some space with the landlord. It may require not having a direct conversation. It may require sending the landlord a letter or getting a supporter, a provider to actually advocate on that person's behalf. Hence a crisis, but not an emergency. So I'm hoping that that lends some examples. Veliek, I hope that helps in that manner. Certainly let me know. So the question then, appreciate it. And this is often a question that arises. How do you then deal with a client or a person whose problem-solving skills are minimal and who perceive everything as a crisis? I don't know if you've come across that. You have a client who everything is a crisis. Bless you. And they've made it very clear that I don't have any coping mechanisms. Nothing works. Everything is a crisis. How do you deal with that situation? When you are able to clearly discern that, yes, the person has minimal coping skills and therefore may not be able to activate them, and they perceive it as a crisis. Even though in your view, it may not seem that way. It may seem more of a problem. There isn't all the other things attached to it, but that's how that person perceives it. How do you deal with it with a person who's in that state of affairs? And Kyra says, nearly all my clients think everything is a crisis. Most are very early in recovery and have little skills. Yes, and that is very common, particularly in substance use, or people who are just out of the psych hospital and is having some transitional challenges and really having difficulty. The reality is it's a very personalized approach. So there isn't a standard that may work for everybody, but it comes down to the same thing that was identified early. And Laura, I guess, find their strengths. What is also important is, at least in the interim, if it's an early phase with that person, if that person perceives it as a crisis and they're acting and thinking that it's a crisis, you have to approach it in that manner until you're able to help them build those coping skills or integrate those coping skills or get them support with someone who can help provide those coping mechanisms for them and some scaffolding. So it's going to require a little more, even though you don't have to necessarily be in crisis mode. You can actually treat and engage with that person the way they perceive the event. So I'm hoping that that helps them, because what's important is if that person perceives it as a crisis and respond to it like a crisis, you have to meet them where they are without necessarily responding in a way that everything is out of control. So you can say, listen, define it as a problem, but the way you're dealing with it requires that kind of scaffolding, that kind of additional supports. But the goal is always to move that person to a place where they become more empowered to engage in the process of dealing with this as it's truly defined. So it may take some work in the early phases, your early engagement with someone, to really get them to the point where you and them can work in synergy based on how that event presents. And Jovian says, would trauma affect how one perceives crisis and emergency? Can that affect their problem? Absolutely. If someone has a history of trauma and that particular event is triggering that trauma response, even if the person may have, the coping mechanism within their arsenal, that triggering event may actually stymie that person from even responding in a practical, logical way and being able to activate their normal coping mechanism, because the person may be in that state of freeze or flight because of the trauma response. And you therefore have to take that into consideration. And hence why it's important to understand your consumer's trauma history, to know that even if an event presents as as a problem, that person's history may actually impact how they respond to that particular event. So a lot of this is very nuanced. Now, there are different categories of crisis, and this is important to note, because when we speak to that, it gives us a sense as to what's not just happening in front of our eyes, but what's the underlying concerns? What are some of the other things that are actually evoking this kind of reaction? So when we speak to categories of crisis, we're talking about maturational crisis, for example. When someone is really struggling with transitioning through a developmental stage, being in a new role, they may lack adequate resources, communication skills, or the system or the community in which they may be in may actually reject them in that role. And a classic example is consumer who may be living with elderly parents, may be an adult in early 40s or middle age, yet their parents can't ever see them and respond to them as an adult because they've always see them and view them in that child mode, in that I have to take care of you mode, in that maternal or paternalistic role. So that person may actually have a crisis in that they may not be getting the supports from their loved ones, from the most significant support system to actually engage and transition to that maturational stage that their age and their development may speak to directly. And that can be a significant challenge for someone. And oftentimes it's very common, particularly folks experiencing severe and persistent mental illness who may be living at home or may be living with elderly parents. And this may occur at any transitional stage. It can happen with teenagers. So it's important to note that that's a category of crisis that is important to discern. Situational crisis is more common, and it can be loss of a relationship, loss of a loved one, a threatens a person's social, physical, and psychological integrity of that person. And situations can be, quite a trigger for crisis engagement or crisis perception. And it's important to note whether or not that person is having a situational crisis based on how it's described and how it presents. Obviously, we know of the disaster, or what we call the adventitious crisis, which is really those huge, big elements, those big events that occur. Pandemic is one of those adventitious or disaster crisis that can engulf a person or a community. Someone being exposed to traumatic events, whether it's rape, assault, can also result in really a disaster crisis category. And looking at that from that perspective is important to know how to intervene. Similar to social cultural crisis, which we've seen a lot almost present proximally or parallel to a pandemic. When an individual community disregards the interests and values of the social society, like age discrimination, gender discrimination, race, class discrimination of many kinds, which can occur simultaneously. So what is important to note here is that a person may be actually experiencing multiple crises simultaneously, but it may present predominantly in one category. Or a situational crisis can then prompt and promote and create other crises for that person. The person's experienced a situational crisis where, for example, you're in a romantic relationship that gets disrupted or you lose that relationship. It can oftentimes trigger that person's maturational struggle that may have been dormant, and that can now come to the forefront. And that person can then be presenting with both the romantic crisis where they have that love and support being lost, and yet they are triggered into going back into that uncertainty and ambivalence about how they're transitioning as an adult, how they're doing as an adult in terms of their independence and autonomy and empowerment. So it's important to understand that crisis can present in multiple categories, but can have a prominent face that may be singular or maybe duplicitous in some regards. So it's very nuanced. You really have to be able to leaf through some of the layers of the presenting crisis. So what is a mental health crisis? Oftentimes, the perception is very clear that someone is presenting with a mental health crisis, but it's important to note what that looks like, how to define that. It's really that jeopardy that is caused by thoughts, behaviors, or emotions, and harm to self and others, or risk of or inability to care for oneself. So even though harm to self or others or inability to care for self is a prominent part of a mental health crisis or prominent presentation, it's not the only form of a mental health crisis. And that's very important to note. Because crises also can include acute conditions that could quickly deteriorate into dangerousness or inability to care for self. So even though it may not be presenting in that moment, the risk for harm, self or others, or inability to care for self, the crisis may precede that, in that that may be what comes from that harrowing element of the crisis. And why we say that is because it's important to note how you are describing a mental health crisis, even in your documentation or your sharing or your articulation with another provider or an authority that you're working with. It's important to note how you're describing a mental health crisis, because too often, public systems in particular, respond as if a mental health crisis and danger to self and others were one and the same. And they aren't. Because in fact, danger to self or others is really derived from common legal language definition. It's really more of a legal perception. When involuntary psychiatric hospitalization may occur, that's the most profound time when that distinction is made from a legal standpoint. But at best, describing a mental health crisis purely and singularly as danger to self and others or inability to care for self is a blunt measure of an extreme emergency. Because remember, we discern clearly what's an emergency from a crisis. More often than not, harm to self and others or inability to care for self is really a mental health emergency. So identifying crisis accurately requires a much more nuanced understanding and a perception that looks beyond whether an individual is dangerous or immediate psychiatric hospitalization is indicated. You have to be able to look beyond that. Because even when behaviors that represent an imminent danger certainly indicates a need for some form of emergency response, these behaviors may well be the culmination, the end stage of a crisis episode, rather than the crisis in its entirety. So it may be the end of the crisis situation where that person presents as danger to self or others or inability to care for self. And remember, only a portion of real-life crisis may present in serious harm to self and others. And a response that is activated only when physical safety becomes an issue is often too little, too late, or no help at all in addressing the root causes of the crisis. And in addition to that, a response that does not meaningfully address the actual issue underlying a crisis may do more harm than good. Because that's oftentimes when we find ourselves recommending involuntary hospitalization from someone because they are presenting that way when we have missed all the early signs of a crisis. So it's important to discern clearly, how are you describing a mental health crisis and differentiating it from that emergency? And we know often what's the manifestation. How does a mental health crisis present? Oftentimes it's those intense feeling of personal distress, from anxiety to depression to anger to panic to hopelessness, changing those functional elements. Oftentimes we see that in neglect of personal hygiene or unusual behavior or signs of psychosis. Or even if the person has experienced a catastrophic event, a disruption in the personal relationship or support system, oftentimes, yes, that can create and lead to the manifestation of a mental health crisis. Victimization is another key trigger to manifestation of mental health crisis. But it often needs to be distinguished from a mental health emergency in order to truly understand what's the appropriate intervention. Think of some other manifestations in your of mental health crisis in your agency. What does that look like? In your most recent experience with a mental health crisis, what did that manifestation look like? What did that person present with? Beyond just, and I'm going to caution, beyond just risk of harm to self or others or inability to care for self. How else did a mental health crisis manifest? What have you seen? Well, think about that. Certainly share as best as you can. I'd love to get a sense as to how did it manifest to your agency, because sometimes we see common manifestations. That's a good one, Joel, keeping children home from school. That's unique in the sense that we've seen some of that. I've seen some of that where that person may not be coping well, and the fear is if the kids go to school, they may actually report what's going on in the home. We often see that oftentimes when people are really maybe self-medicating or not managing very well. That oftentimes is a manifestation that may not seem like a crisis indicator, but often if you know the person's history, maybe. But that's a very unique one, but often one that is understated. And then we can consider the predictors of crisis. There are some predictors, particularly in the supported housing environment, when we look at tenant factors. Oftentimes you look at that person's ADL skills performance. Is it changing drastically? Is there a decrease or an increase drastically? Is there indications of a lowered frustration tolerance? Is that person approaching or is on the precipice of an anniversary that is typically by history triggering to them? Is there indications of relapse? And Ruslan says intensively, obsessively getting involved in activity. Yes, person can be presenting with some manic symptoms or manic signs, and it's really out of control in that sense, and may not recognize it within themselves. But you, having a sense of what their baseline functioning is, can make those distinction. In the world of substance use, as well as it's more general across the board, we look at what we call HALT. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. When those things are existing simultaneously or together, they oftentimes are really an indication of a predictor of crisis or distress. And we look at the environmental factors as well. Unmet needs, going unmet for a long time, whether it's housing, whether it's food, whether it's financial benefits, can actually be indicators of crisis. We talk about in a lot of our supported housing programs, whether it's congregate housing or not, those tension centers, those places where people gather, but tension tends to rise in those centers, those oftentimes can give us a tenor of what's going on. That screaming and hollering in the lunchroom, or that screaming and hollering in the people getting into each other's faces in the community room. Those are indicators that crisis is probably ensuing. Changes in normal routine. Special times of the month can also be indicators of predictors of crisis. Check day. Someone's pacing back and forth in front of the mailbox on check day can be a sign of things that are going to go south if that doesn't arrive. And that person start thinking of, oh, my rent is going to not be paid. I can't get food. I can't pay my debt, all that stuff. And before you know it, things are out of control. Or clinic day, that person is having challenges with managing their symptoms and have to present where someone is going to assess them and evaluate them, may actually create a predictor of a crisis. Now, what I want to look at quickly is the essential principles of appropriate crisis response. What are the guidelines? What are the underpinnings of what's an appropriate response to crisis? What is it we should actually ensure that we are seeing and presenting when we are appropriately responding to crisis? We should strive to always avoid harm, establishing physical and psychological safety for the person in a crisis. A crisis response, when appropriate, should be person-centered. It should really reflect an understanding of the person's unique circumstances, preferences, and goals. And that may be articulated in a crisis plan, in an advanced directives in other areas, or known to the person who that person is working with more closely. It should be trauma-informed. Our interventions should be trauma-informed. It should be reinforcing. It should ensure safety. It should promote choice and collaboration, trustworthiness, and it should always strive to empower that person to take more and more a self-directed approach to addressing their crisis. And it should reflect an understanding of how that person perceives personal safety. What is needed for that person to experience a sense of security? Not your perception of whether or not that person feels secure, but an understanding as to how that person demonstrates by articulation or by history how they feel secure. And that may be, I feel secure when my assigned caseworker is leading the crisis intervention and not some stranger that I don't know and don't trust. What are some other principles of appropriate crisis response? It should be strength-based. Identifying and reinforcing accessible resources to aid recovery. The person should be connected to resources. They should have that sense of we're actually empowering you to manage this and future crises as best as you can. It should really reflect the whole person. Look at the whole person. We're talking about exploring the interplay of psychiatric issues with other health factors and other factors in that person's life. So we're not simply going into that crisis saying, the reason why you're in crisis is because you're not managing your symptoms of bipolar disorder or whatever very well. We should not assume that every crisis with a person who has a severe and persistent mental illness is derived from that mental illness. Recovery, resilience, and natural support should be emphasized. We should really support that person's larger journey towards recovery and resilience. It should not be just about this moment. It should be about now and future events and how we actually present that person with the best supports possible. Best access to skills, knowledge, and resources and supports in the environment. And prevention. it should also really take a conscientious look and effort towards addressing unmet needs to minimize future relapse. So what that means is when we address this particular crisis, we are not just saying, well, okay, you're no longer using in this moment, when historically we know that persons need the support of a 12-step group or a supported environment or a sober environment in order to sustain. So when we speak about crisis interventions in particular, we must focus on what the goals are for crisis intervention. Not only to mitigate the individual's adverse reaction to the immediate crisis, but to facilitate coping and planning to manage current and present and future crises. And to normalize the reaction to crisis. We can't overplay and overemphasize a crisis as though it's an anomaly when we know that all of us, whether we are coping with a severe mental illness or coping with challenges around employment, crisis is ubiquitous. It occurs to all of us. It's not some outlandish, you are such a unique person to be experiencing a crisis. So it's important to make sure that we normalize it, even when we're addressing that crisis. And we must, as a goal, as an object, as really something to strive for, assess the individual's capacity and need for further supports and referral. So that follow-up element, ensuring that that person is connected and has access to the supports that will be needed, not just for managing the aftermath of this crisis, but to actually be able to have those supports in place for future crises. And then we ask, why is crisis intervention important specifically in supported housing? Because it's a Medicaid required service, actually. And for those who are involved in FCS, you know that at home and community-based services has a crisis interventions, a crisis management element to it that is critical, particularly for tenancy sustaining services. So Medicaid requires it. Your biller, the person who reimburses you, require crisis intervention, skills, knowledge, and competence. And services in permanent supported housing has the specificity of that ethical and legal obligation to provide crisis interventions and crisis support to clients in permanent supported housing. It strives to preserve the safety of tenants and others, to establish crisis procedures, and to support advanced directives and crisis plans, really empower people to think, plan, and prepare for future crises. So when we ask why crisis intervention, why is it important to supported housing? Because our funder, because the agency that reimburses our services demand that we have that competency and skill, as well as a service, supported housing has crisis management as a salient legal and ethical obligation to provide that service. What are some crisis interventions models and approach that are common, that are useful, that are related to supported housing, that are applicable to supported housing? One of the most common one is actually Robert's 7-stage crisis intervention model. Don't know how familiar you are with it, but it's one of the most common approaches to crisis management. And it really has those 7 steps that articulate and gives a roadmap as to how you should intervene. Plan and conduct a thorough biopsychosocial and lethality and imminent danger assessment. So you're assessing those things up front. You're making that psychological contact. You're making that initial engagement, the rapport building. You identify the major problems, including crisis and precipitants. So what are the stuff that are precipitating the crisis, and what does the crisis look like in its true sense? You really encourage that catharsis, that opportunity to have the person in crisis express their feelings and emotions. and you explore the general alternatives with that person. What options do we have given your current situation? Is voluntary hospitalization optional or the best approach here? Is this really an emergency? And if it isn't, do you need supports? Can we get you to a crisis center? Do we call crisis to intervene? And then the hope is really to restore functioning through implementation of an action plan. So you make a plan for this current crisis to be resolved and future crisis, and you ensure you do follow up. And certainly, what's important for folks in supported housing is to know how, particularly, the police and other authorities intervene. What kind of crisis model is commonly used by a law enforcement? And oftentimes, it's that crisis intervention team model. And one of the most common one is the CAF model, which is calm, assess, and facilitate. And that was really derived from the Memphis Crisis Intervention Team, the police department, and it's become more common across most states, particularly among law enforcement agencies. So it really speaks to how do you achieve that calm, to decrease the emotional, behavioral, and mental intensity of the situation, to assess to determine the most appropriate response as presented by the facts, and to facilitate, to really promote the most appropriate resolution based on the assessment of the facts. And there's lots of resources and information to really get a good sense of each one of these approaches. And I'm hoping that this is familiar or common in Washington as it is across a number of states, mental health first aid. Which really, the benefits of mental health first aid is that it can be applied by anyone until a mental health provider arrives on the scene. So it really speaks to assess the approach, assess and assist if the crisis is determined. And there's some simple markers as to how you can define a crisis. You listen, not judgmentally, give support and information. And oftentimes this is where the person may simply say, this is the crisis number. Do you want me to call that number for you? Can I call someone that you trust who will assist you in this crisis situation? You encourage that person to seek appropriate help. Hey, please don't, depart when 911 is being called. It's important for you to get that kind of support. Let them help you determine whether or not you need emergent care, and encourage other supports. Do you have a loved one that you can call? So it's one of those approaches that, like medical first aid, it can be provided in that moment by a non-professional until the appropriate skilled person arrives. So it's one of those techniques that is good to really take a look at. And then there's the overall agency crisis management system. From pre-crisis preparation to follow-up and referral, you have those one-on-one intervention counseling, you have the critical incident stress debriefing elements. Most agencies have that as part of your quality control elements. And it's important to know your agency's crisis, critical incident stress management approach. Now, why do you need a crisis plan? Oftentimes when we ask clients, why do you need a crisis plan? Because your mental health emergency deserves the same kind of preparation as you would any other aspect of your life. You deserve safety and peace of mind. And crisis plans can also help to reduce forced or involuntary hospitalization admissions for your clients. And people, you're able to help to learn what works and what doesn't work from someone by history. And it makes recovery more streamlined. Now, what are some crisis plans that we use commonly in supported housing? We have the standard crisis plan, which often is dictated by the agency. It may have certain features, but it may be unique to your agency or it may be common. But oftentimes it really includes the preferred supports, the providers, the person's treatment history that worked, and preferred facilities. Then there's the psychiatric advance directives that is often, for a number of agencies, are developed and formulated at a time of assessment. The intake assessment, oftentimes that person is offered an opportunity to create and implement an advanced psychiatric advance directive. And it's important to note it's a legal document that can only be enacted when that person is determined to be unable to manage on their own behalf. It requires someone being identified as a person to act on that person's behalf. And it's often written when the person is not in crisis. So it's an advantage to writing it when it's not in crisis. And there's the WRAP plan, or the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, that is often commonly used across a number of agencies, or is really associated primarily. It's more commonly seen in substance use services, but has been over time adopted nicely into mental health and other services. But that's really where a person not just only plans for crisis, but really illustrates and articulates other areas, a list of wellness tools, the daily routine, the stressors that they know of, early warning signs of a crisis plan, and what kind of post-crisis plan that person would like to have. So these are crisis plans that can be implemented and instructed, and there's lots of clarity around what they are and what they look like. What I want to quickly jump into as we're coming down to the end of our services, what is the implication for supervision when we speak to crisis? What is important here is that with your team, you want to make sure the training is in place. The training must provide staff with the tools to identify, intervene, and follow up on crisis situations. Supervision must be constant and consistently in place to provide trauma-informed supervision, and we spoke to that early in the year, to really support staff in not just dealing with client crisis, but to deal with their own potential for crisis, to help them deal with risk of burnout, secondary trauma, and compassion fatigue, so that they're able to actually be equipped and empowered to help others in crisis. We want to orient our staff to programmatic interventions and crisis plans and crisis prevention policies and procedure that our agency has, so that they're adhering to the agency protocols and policies. And we want to teach and reinforce safeguards and hazards for effective crisis response. What are some things you need to look out for? And they can include a number of things. Anticipate what lies ahead. Help your staff navigate the changes in terms of direction as needed. As a safeguard, as a supervisor, you need to be flexible and adapt to the approach to manage the crisis. You cannot hold on to a plan that is not working. You can't have a singular way of addressing and dealing with a crisis or supporting staff in crisis, because the staff may need different supports. It's important to learn and grow and apply lessons learned. Examine how crisis was managed and identify areas for improvement as you move forward. So I want to also take a quick moment. If you have specific questions, I want to be able to give people the opportunity for questions. But what I want to also lend to folks is that there's a great deal of resources at the end of this particular presentation that is going to be extremely useful as you address crisis in your teams. So I'm going to stop the recording here and quickly ask if you take a few seconds to complete the evaluation so that we get some feedback as to how you have experienced the supported Housing Supervisors Learning Community for the year and this particular crisis intervention session. But certainly, if you have questions I appreciate it if you can present those questions. I also want if you could take a few moments to complete the evaluation, will give me some feedback as to how things are going, what can be changed for the new year, what can be enhanced, what is working well. How do you see the learning community evolving? We'll send an assessment and evaluation a little later on, but certainly take a moment and fill out the application, the evaluation as best as you can for me. I appreciate it. So I want to wish you all great rest of the day, great rest of the year. Happy holidays to you all. Thank you very much for being part of the Supervisors Learning community. And we look forward to seeing you next year with more engaging interactions and learning opportunities.